Okay.
Well, let me go ahead and since we're recording officially, let me just go ahead and say that our presenter today for the Texas Water Journal webinar series is Dr. Rachel Fern with the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, who's going to talk about her recent article in the Texas Water Journal, for which she was the lead author, The State of Texas Wetlands.
All right. So I am going to stop my video because I know not everyone's connections are great and I think that slows it down sometimes. So let me stop my camera if I can find a video. All right. Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started. I'm going to skip forward through this first slide. The drone video will come back at the end, I promise, so you won't miss anything. Um, so I'm going to start out kind of basic, and then we're going to get into, towards the end, kind of a more legislative human dimensions kind of part of it. So super basic. Wetlands need a particular set of conditions to form on the landscape. So generally, wetlands develop in areas where there's a reliable water source, which makes sense. So this can be in the floodplains of rivers, including old channel scars, areas flooded by beaver dams. In these cases, wetlands receive water from overbank flooding or subsurface connections with the water table. They can also form in depressions on the landscape where water accumulates from rains to no amount, surface runoff. There's all sorts of different types. Generally, if you have to say it in a sentence, wetlands are the transitional zone between the water body and land. So that being said, there is technically no standard definition of a wetland. And I want to make the distinction now here early. We're going to talk a lot about the recent Sackett v. EPA decision and the Clean Water Act and what is technically defined as waters of the U.S. or WOTUS. Wetlands are not wetlands and WOTUS are different words, so these are not interchangeable by any means. Wetlands generally have three features. Um, Everyone can agree on this, that they must have at least one of these features. Support plants that live in wet conditions. They have wet, undrained soil, and that gets a little bit fuzzy in wetland types. And three, have non-soil ground that is wet or covered by water at some point during the growing season of each year. This also gets a little bit muddy, pun intended, a little bit later when we start talking about the biological and ecological functions of some of the soils. So, like I said before, I'm going to contradict myself. Just about everyone agrees on that definition of a wetland. However, a little white lie to qualify that, the Fish and Wildlife Service includes actually both unvegetated areas like playas and mudflats. And remember, the standard definition that everyone kind of mostly agrees on is that it has to support aquatic or wetland vegetation. So U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service actually takes into account those that are unvegetated and also rocky shorelines. So aquatic beds without true wetland soils. So this takes on a more biological definition since it includes areas that don't necessarily have those physical characteristics exactly, but still play a similar role or perform the same functions as wetlands that do fit that criteria. So I'll contradict myself again, another tiny little lie. The U.S. Army Corps actually classifies areas as wetlands only if they possess all three of these under normal conditions. And I put that in quotations because that is the real language. We're just now starting to firm up what technically normal circumstances are. But generally, this is pretty subjective. So according to the Army Corps of Engineers, the area must possess all three. So the hydrology, so wet or signs of it being intermittently wet, like that high water line you can see on that tree. It must have wetland soils, which I've got a nice little, I am obsessed with PowerPoint animation, so I've got a little fun animation, wetland soil creation, and that wetland vegetation. So here's the situation in Texas. So wetlands, and we've got almost 4 million acres. The states in front of us, first place comes in at Alaska at around 61 million acres. So that makes sense. Florida is ahead of us as well, about 11.5 million acres, makes sense. Minnesota, I'm a little offended, 11 million acres, and Louisiana is sitting there at 8. So we are number 5. So not in true Texas fashion. We're not first in this one, but we do get a participation award because we still are 5 out of 50. And interestingly enough, almost half of Texas's wetland acres are actually forested. So when we, go to meetings out of state and out of the country, I think the common perception of Texas, well, first of all, people are generally surprised that we have wetlands at all. And the perception is this dry wasteland, deserts, maybe some like desert oases or something as wetlands, but actually the majority of ours are forested. They're shrub scrub wetlands. These are heavily vegetated. They tend to stay inundated most of the time. And bogs and pitcher plant bogs and seeps and stuff are included in this category. So got quite a few of those. We've also got quite a few freshwater emergence. So this is kind of like your typical freshwater flooded meadow type wetland. So a couple, and I won't spend too much time on this because I want to get kind of to the meat of this, but I think this is really important for context. So I was going between titles for this, and I was gonna say the jack of all streams, because wetlands do a lot of different functions, but I didn't want to put that in writing in case I get roasted for it later. It's a silly pun. So Texas actually sits in the middle of the Central Flyway. So if you're not familiar with migratory flyways, these are generally highways in the sky for migratory birds that move from their overwintering grounds in Central and South America to their breeding range in the Arctic and the subarctic tundra. So a lot of these birds will travel from Argentina, Venezuela, Colombia, Guatemala, all the way up to Alaska and some areas of the Northern Territories in Canada. So we've got about 400 million migratory birds that pass through each year. I think that number honestly is a little bit low, but Texas sees, so of all of the Neo-Arctic, Neotropic. So these are the bird species that actually go from South or Central America all the way up to the Arctic and back every year. A lot of our songbirds and waterfowl. 98.5% of all of those species occur in Texas. So our wetlands are pretty important, specifically on the coast and the riparian wetlands throughout South and Central Texas. The playas and the panhandle are especially crucial for migratory survival, especially when it comes to waterfowl and wading birds, cranes. So we also support plenty of other species, around 230 species of reptiles and amphibians, which is pretty high relatively compared to some other states. A lot of those are endangered or endemic, and there are a lot of pelagic fishes and valuable sport fish that require the fresh and brackish wetlands and estuaries on the coast to complete their life cycle. So either through spawning or as nurseries for juvenile. So wetlands save lives. This little animation going back and forth is before and after Hurricane Harvey. So this is 2017. And this, I just wanted to show, so that clean picture right there is August 23rd before Harvey hit. There, August 30th, you can see all of that sediment, all of that coastal erosion, all of that runoff from urban centers, from wetlands interiorly that actually moved into the Gulf. So this was a tremendous amount of pressure applied to the system. So Wetlands act as natural sponges. So they absorb, store water flooding, they reduce downstream flooding, they buffer storm surges and provide habitat for soil stabilizing plants, which kind of provides a positive feedback loop. And they slow down the water and release it into the soil slowly, so that it either gets captured, so that floating sediment either gets captured before it reaches the rivers and then ultimately the ocean. And it also captures, they also capture pollutants, and other things. So make Hurricane Harvey, that's the sediment loss and erosion there. So as far as buffering storm events, some specific examples on the upper coast around Port Arthur and the Sabine, there are some studies before and after natural disasters. So not just Harvey, but several others, that show that the wetlands there actually reduce flood heights by up to 70%, where those wetlands are intact. So it's quite a buffering effect. In the Galveston Bay region, so this is storms or no storms, this is on average every single year, wetlands provide storm protection benefits that equal roughly $2 billion every year. And interestingly enough, and this just came out late last year, there was a study out of Columbia University that found under the current conditions in the US, 1 hectare of wetland is worth upwards of $8,000 annually, although this is extremely regionally specific. And here we're talking about infrastructure damage. So on that note, we like to talk a lot about the wetland loss in the Houston area, and it is a significant issue as that city is growing. But there are still many wetland acres that are intact, whether by intentional protection or they've just proven to be too feral to conquer for now. So research following Hurricane Harvey estimates that the existing wetlands reduced flooding by as much as 80% in some areas during Hurricane Harvey, which likely saved lives. So, and it's difficult to put an economic evaluation on that. This is I-10 before and after, or before and during, for the exact same shot from the exact same angle during the flooding. So roughly 25% of Texans actually live in the coastal zone. 17% of those that live there live below the poverty line. And so in the absence of seawalls, sound levees, proper development grading, I could go on, wetlands are a first line of defense and a solid line of defense against damage and loss. Wetlands also support lives. So these are Texas numbers and specifically. So what's kind of unique about our state is that for many private landowners, hunting lease and fishing hunting access income actually exceeds potential agricultural income. And we're starting to see some interesting situations in the rice farming regions on the coast. So to put that in perspective, waterfowl hunting brings about $1 billion annually into the Texas economy, and supports about 14,000 jobs. Hunting others is this is a stab at big game. So other will include white-tailed deer, mule deer, pronghorn, bighorn sheep, alligator, all of our other hunting, squirrels, we'll throw that in there as well, brings in about 1.2 billion. So you can kind of see how waterfowl it provides a significant portion of our recreational income and supports about 32,000 jobs, which is quite a lot. The fresh and saltwater fishing brings in about $5.5 billion. Interestingly enough, the majority of that is from our freshwater fishing or inland fishing and supports around 88,000 jobs. Non-consumptive, that refers to our recreationalists, so bird watchers like myself, hikers, mountain bikers, brings in about $4.1 billion each year into the Texas economy. And it's difficult to say how many jobs this supports because that is such a broad, all-encompassing kind of category. Wetlands actually improve lives as well. So they absorb and filter nutrients, sediments, pollutants that would otherwise degrade our rivers and our reservoirs. Nitrogen is actually the primary driver in the wetland biogeochemical cycle. And again, I'll towards the end, I've got a nice little PowerPoint animation um, that kind of shows roughly how that cycle operates. So we produce a lot of nitrogen, just in general, us. Industrial discharge, sewage, laundry detergents, pet waste, lawn and crop fertilizers. And so when it rains, nitrogen and phosphorus makes its way through the watersheds into rivers and reservoirs. So this dump is actually sped up by impervious surfaces like concrete that don't allow the water to be absorbed by the soil or slowed down by plants. So intact wetlands, wetlands that are functioning the way they're supposed to, are the first, and in a lot of places, the only barrier for this runoff before it hits a river. So why does this suck? Nitrogen and phosphorus overload can cause harmful algal blooms, big fish kills due to the depletion of oxygen in the water column, and a lot of vegetation die-off. So harmful algal blooms are a particular concern in our reservoirs and lakes, since they're not only used for drinking water, but also recreation. So if anyone in the Austin area remembers or has unfortunately been affected by the recent blue-green algae blooms in Lake Travis and Lake Austin, that killed many dogs, many pets, that was a result of massive harmful algal blooms. These toxins actually make it through our drinking water as well, and some of that actually can be found in breast milk, in human breast milk, and there have been some studies that have found that as well. In addressing wetland loss, there are now many constructed wetlands, and there's some disagreement about whether or not they function in the same way as natural ones. So in some cases, constructed wetlands can achieve 85, 86% of the removal of pollutants that a natural wetland can filter. So, and that's it's really difficult to quantify that. And so we have specific operations that we've employed in this state, and I'll give the Tarrant Regional Water District quite a bit of pats on the back, and our staff as well, and Ducks Unlimited, for making these huge projects happen. We have two very large, around 1,700 acre complexes that are situated on the Trinity River, which is a notoriously, and not so much anymore. It's actually very, very clean now, relatively, but it was historically a very polluted, degraded river. This gets most of the drainage from the DFW Metroplex and then travels towards Houston. So one of these complexes is the George Shannon Wetlands Project. So that's the picture on the left there. It was installed and it's managed jointly with Tarrant Regional Water District, our staff, Parks and Wildlife, and Ducks Unlimited. We have more friends now as we expand. Pepsi and Facebook, Meta, have started contributing as well. The project is built for nutrient reduction and municipal wastewater, mainly from the DFW Metro, before it's either pumped to the Richland Chambers Reservoir for drinking water for DFW or enters the Trinity watershed. So it's a series of 24 wetland units adjacent to the river. It filters about 90 million gallons of water a day from the water district. From this wetland complex in particular, 95% of the suspended sediment of the water that comes in, and 3/4 of the nitrogen and about half of the phosphorus are captured before entering the Trinity. So we love projects like this. It's multi-purpose. It provides wildlife habitat as well as the filtration for our water. The Tarrant Regional Water District is also constructing another reuse project adjacent to Cedar Creek Reservoir. So this one will be about 3,300 acres and is expected to filter an average of 156 million gallons per day, much of it getting reused and delivering water to a little over 1 million residents in the DFW area. Wetlands also sustain lives. So Texas is the second most populous state in the US, and has the highest emissions in the US. If we were a country, we would be the 8th largest emitter in the world. So if we ever do secede, we'll take that that ribbon there. Um, the industrial sector, so refineries and petrochemical plants account for about half of those emissions. We are a very industrial heavy state. We do produce a lot towards the US GDP. And I'll make the distinction here. So we've got freshwater and saltwater wetlands, and we're going to talk about sort of how the climate implications of these. Tidally influenced, so coastal wetlands actually store up to 10 times more of greenhouse gas and carbon than the freshwater wetlands, just because of the slow decomposition of organic matter. So at this point, and I'm going to get into this towards the end, but I want to make the distinction in greenhouse gases. We use that as an umbrella term. We use it to refer to many gases that have different processes, some of which have more severe implications with regards to water quality and climate change. And so we're going to tease that out just a little bit and hopefully have some reference material for that. The greenhouse gas term should be qualified. So a little bit about the different regions of Texas, just to kind of give some context of regional challenges. We'll start in West Texas in the Panhandle. So the majority of this region is in a semi-arid climate. So wetlands here are typically riparian corridors, or corridors being areas that run parallel along the sides of the rivers, or rainwater basins. And these are our playa wetlands. Although there are some wetland pools fed by springs, especially in West Texas. You can't really talk about water in West Texas without talking about the Ogallala Aquifer. So that's that top middle picture there. It's actually one of the largest aquifers in the world and provides water for a little over a quarter of all of the irrigated land in the US comes from this aquifer. There are also many municipalities, especially in Texas, that rely on this groundwater for their use. And the way this aquifer recharges is through playas, is through the wetlands. So if you look on the center at the bottom, that is a picture of a few playa wetlands. They're isolated. They generally do not connect, and they generally, and these actually have kind of a small watershed, but they generally have larger watersheds. They function a little bit differently than potholes. I know that it looks kind of similar. There's a one-way groundwater interaction, and they spend a significant portion of time in a dry state. Sometimes they'll be dry for years, and that's because of the type of soil in these basins has a very high clay concentration. When it dries up, it cracks and shrinks at the top of the ground, and so when the fall rains return in a normal year, if they return, it allows that water to move downward very quickly during those rainfall events, and it captures that moisture before it has a chance to evaporate, because again, this is a semi-arid climate. And the clay itself not only filters the water running off the ag fields, but it slows down the travel to the aquifer proper, giving plant roots a chance to pull even more stuff out, like nitrogen. These playas have virtually never fallen under federal jurisdiction due to their isolation. So the burden to protect these wetlands have fallen to the individual groundwater districts. Central Texas and the Hill Country. So this is where I live. This is where Todd lives. So a little bit about our home country. The majority of wetlands here are spring fed and are also riparian corridors. We also have a lot of development here, which of course requires water. And I won't get into the very heated politics surrounding groundwater use in residential development, specifically in this region, but we do have some very special aquifers here due to the large underground karst formations. And so those are those limestone caves that you think of when you think of like the bats in Central Texas. But the unique geology here actually has some pretty dangerous, albeit awesome, implications. And that is that the Texas Hill Country is actually the flash flooding capital of the world. And there are specific criteria that a rainfall event must meet in order to qualify for that. So this is the Pedernales, I always say that wrong, near Llano, Texas. So this is one of several rivers that's known for its flash flooding. This development between that before and after, same day. Some flash flood events have seen this river rise 33 feet in only a few hours, and it has reached a peak flow rate of more than double that of Niagara Falls. So another way to think of that is that's just about 2 Olympic-sized swimming pools of water per second, which is a tremendous amount of water. A lot of the wetland loss in this region has been due to dams and channelization of rivers to allow for development. And this exacerbates the flooding impacts. And a lot of times these channels are built to prevent flooding. But unfortunately, water's going to find a way. And we're seeing, as the climate kind of shifts, we are seeing more extreme flooding events that are kind of conquering our infrastructure that we've built so far. This is a picture of Wimberley. This is in 2015, the Blanco River near my house. This river rose 30 feet in 3 hours, and I think took the lives of 14 people. Entire houses and roads were lifted up and delivered downstream. So it's quite the unique. Our wetlands here in Central Texas are the ones that we still have are crucial. They are vital. They are life-saving. All right, on to East Texas and the Piney Woods. You'll see it looks very blue. So remember, about half of our wetlands are actually forested. 40% of all the wetlands in the state actually exists in East Texas as bottomland hardwood forests, forested floodplains of very large and slow East Texas rivers and bogs. So if anyone's familiar with this type of ecological setting, you know that these systems take decades and sometimes centuries to form and can essentially be unmitigatable. This area is really hard because of the natural gas and timber industry, and also the rapid urban suburban expansion. Obviously, we're losing wetlands to direct land conversion as wetlands are drained, filled for new development. But many of these wetlands are actually being lost indirectly through hydrological disruption as a result of channelization, damming, land subsidence upstream or nearby. So this area is a little bit tough. Everything is very connected. Onwards to South Texas and the brush country. The Resakas, so these are little offshoots of rivers that got isolated after a flood event. They technically fall under the umbrella of riparian. These are also known as oxbow lakes, and they're formed by remnant riverbeds left by floods. They accrete soil through periodic flooding as well. So their very nature is to sever surface water connection, and we'll talk about surface water connection. But these wetlands are a vital source of water for wildlife and are instrumental in capturing dust and sediment in this semi-arid climate and on its way to the Rio Grande. So you can imagine how some wetlands along the Rio Grande and its tributaries can be inconvenient for some operations and wall constructions, but I will leave it at that, so that these wetlands are pretty threatened. Many of the efforts to sustain human life actually in this region are beneficial to the wetlands here, like the desalination plants being installed near El Paso. Onwards to the Gulf Coast. Texas has 300, sorry, that number is incorrect. Many miles of coastline, thousands, from the Louisiana border to Mexico, and a little under 1 million acres of wetland in this zone. Many of these exist in the deltas of large rivers as they terminate into the Gulf. There tends to be a relatively constant surface water connection here, and we'll start mentioning that more. However, the freshwater wetlands are obviously not. If they did have a continuous surface water connection, they would be saltwater because that's the ocean. So this comes into play in a second when we look at marsh migration. But so some unique challenges here in our state. Actually, this is not unique to our state, but we are experiencing a sort of a severe form of this. So The coastal squeeze. This is a phenomenon by which intertidal habitats and freshwater wetlands are lost due to the high water mark being fixed by a defense or structure, and the low water mark migrating inward in response to sea level rise. So as that sea level rises, it is intruding onto those traditionally freshwater wetlands. And so reasonably so, the freshwater wetlands migrate inward. Hopefully, but more often than not, they are met by some topographic, so like a hill or dunes or something like that, where they can no longer migrate inwards, or a seawall. And so then they just disappear. So as a reminder, 25% of the state population lives in this zone. The average relative sea level rise globally was in recent millennia about 0.2 millimeters a year. In the 20th century, it was estimated about 1.8 millimeters a year and is now estimated to be at 3 millimeters a year. That's globally. In some parts of Texas, relative sea level rise is as high as 8 millimeters a year. So we're seeing quite a bit. There's some more insidious effects of this too. So increasing attention is being paid to the intrusion of seawater moving upstream in rivers and surface waters, which is a problem. But we're also seeing a rapid increase in the subsurface movement of seawater into the aquifers, and salinizing wetlands and our aquifers. So here's an example. That orange or yellow is agricultural land use. That blue is today. This is where the sea level is, and I don't have the ocean blue, but those are areas that are below sea level that are inundated. By 2050, we are expecting about a foot of sea level rise. If anyone was in the literature 10 years ago, and the scientific literature 10 years ago, this was considered an extreme scenario. However, as it is 2024, and models are being updated, this is no longer considered an extreme value. This is the expected value. We are approaching this number. So you can already kind of see how that sea level is abutting developed land. And then by 2100, again, this was considered an extreme number. It is now considered the norm. This is the expected number, for around 4 feet, a little under 4 feet by the year 2100. And you can kind of see that overlap. And so that's where we see that squeeze. We see the same thing here with municipal development. That's today. Already there's some purple, especially on the island near Galveston. And then by 2100, we see quite a bit. So this will be interesting. I say interesting. This will be devastating to kind of watch how this progresses. And there's some ripple effects too, of changing weather patterns due to climate change. And so dams, Texas has the greatest number of dams in the United States, around 7,500. And that's really only the registered or permitted ones with permitted through TCEQ. And so it's actually estimated there's an average of one small to medium-sized dam every 120 kilometers of river across the state. So like everyone else, as the climate is changing and causing a seesaw of extreme drought and flooding, in drought, municipalities and private landowners reasonably hold back more water in the reservoirs and lakes and release less downstream. This amplifies the drought effect downstream and causes massive hydrological shifts in wetlands downstream. So less freshwater inflow, which allows for saltwater intrusion and also certain pathogens to proliferate, and just less flow in general. The Texas Water Development Board has included the installation of 22 new reservoirs. If anyone is online currently and can correct me on those numbers, if those are incorrect, please let me know. I don't know if I have an old draft of the water plan. I think it's 2012. No. 22 new reservoirs, so 14 to be functional by 2030. And the remaining 8 to be functional by 2050. So reservoirs create additional fisheries habitat and increase the number of lacustrine wetlands. But there's some significant adverse impacts which can occur to our shallow wetlands nearby. So wetlands are lost either through direct inundation, so the flooding that happens when the dam is built, and altered downstream hydrology from the reservoirs. So about 1.5 million acres of natural vegetation, including 600,000 acres of bottomland hardwoods. These are very sensitive forests, very important, are estimated to have been lost from the reservoirs built already as of 1995. And we've had more reservoirs put in since then. So these losses, they're not spread evenly over the state either. They're rather concentrated in the East Texas river systems. So we see a lot of disease outbreaks. So 3 things here. The increasing frequency of extreme rainfall events due to climate change degrade water quality in wetlands through influxes of nutrient-rich stormwater runoff. So we talked about that nitrogen and phosphorus loading. And it speeds up the reproduction of and the proliferation of disease-causing organisms that are already present in the water. On top of that, we see increasing temperatures, which fuel harmful algal blooms by allowing for longer growth seasons. And then also we see intensifying droughts on the other end, and this concentrates wildlife into smaller and smaller areas, increasing the density and likelihood of disease outbreaks like cholera and other waterborne diseases. So right now, HPAI is a huge concern. Avian cholera was actually first observed near Muleshoe in the Panhandle. It was the first observation in North America, but a long time ago. And then harmful algal blooms. And that is a real picture, by the way. So this is my lovely animation. The reason why I put this in here is because when we talk about the legislative side of this, when we talk about the policy side, I think it's important to understand exactly what we're protecting. So with wetlands, it is 100%, it's all about the soil. So in the soil, we have many microorganisms, we have bacteria, we have fungi, we have protozoa. All of these require oxygen, like most things. So I'm just going to shrink them and put them right here. So if the soil is exposed to the atmosphere, to the air, so this is a dry soil, or it can be a moist soil, but either way, it's not completely inundated. It is exposed, it gets a choice of element that it wants to use for its respiration, for its to stay alive. It's going to choose oxygen. That's great. Free and easy exchange, plenty of oxygen because it's exposed to the air. The result of that is carbon dioxide and water vapor. However, if that soil is now inundated, yes, there are still roughly the same, and I'm actually going to take out water vapor and hydrogen because those are, no water, it's water, and hydrogen is very, very trace element in water. And so it's left with this. So cool. I'll use the oxygen to survive. Well, as that gets depleted, it starts to have to look at other things. So the longer it's inundated, the more oxygen is depleted from the water column. And so it's forced to look for other things, in the soil. So we have a lot of elements in the soil as well. So the next thing it's going to go to is nitrates and manganese. So we talk about nitrogen loading and stuff. The wetland soils can actually process this nitrogen and make it available for plants, for plant growth, and also just pull it out of the water column and into the soil and into the bodies itself before it can cause, harmful algal blooms and stuff like that. As a result of that, there's a chemical reaction here, and you're actually left with little iron deposits. So you'll see if you put a shovel into a wetland soil, you'll see about midway some orange layers, and that's actually iron that's precipitating out. And that's about all that's left almost all that's left at this point once it's used all of its nitrogen. And so it's like, they're like, okay, well, I'll try to use the iron then. And so it does use the iron. When the iron is used up, If you put that shovel into a wetland soil, the soil turns this really light gray color, um, as it's kind of you know, depleted of just about everything. And so this is where we separate in saltwater wetlands. And we talk about carbon storage and methane storage and greenhouse gas sequestration. Saltwater wetlands have a greater capacity for that than freshwater. And so at this point, when everything else is depleted in the soil and the microorganisms have to switch to sulfate, we are now storing carbon. And so it takes a while for a wetland to be inundated for it to start actually having those positive effects on greenhouse gas sequestration and carbon. So once it starts using sulfate, we are left with hydrogen sulfide gas. So if you have walked out into a saltwater marsh and had the privilege of stepping in a very soft spot and gone up to your hip, that hydrogen sulfide gas smells like rotten eggs. That is the byproduct of that sulfate reduction. So it's really smelly, and it will eventually turn it a little bit brown too. Freshwater wetlands, a little bit different here. So it instead of, and I'll say in saltwater soil that is inundated by salt water, there is an abundance of sulfates that is available for those reactions. However, in freshwater wetlands, not so much. And so it actually uses the trace byproducts of all of those reactions to create methane. And this is where we, when we talk about intermittency and ephemeral things that are or are not protected federally, these freshwater wetland soils are actually producing methane. And so wetlands are actually a significant source of methane, methane being a more potent greenhouse gas. And so carbon dioxide is more abundant in the atmosphere, but methane actually has the global warming potential over a 100-year period of 25 times greater than CO2. And that methane is produced in anaerobic soils of wetlands. So while it's inundated, the methane product exists in the soil and it is captured there and it stays there. However, if that wetland then dries up, that methane can be released. And if it is re-wetted and stays wet long enough, it will regenerate again. And so as the climate changes and we start seeing this huge seesaw from drought to flood, from drought to flood, we're producing methane, releasing it, producing methane, releasing it. And so that's something that doesn't get quite a lot of discussion. I'm going to sift through this. I just wanted to put that in there for reference material. And we'll get to the really interesting stuff here. So onward to some policy and legislation. This is when WOTUS, so this is Waters of the United States, was first defined. It included waters that were being used for interstate or foreign commerce, navigable waters that cross state boundaries, non-navigable waters that were contained even within a state that, if degraded, could have an impact on interstate commerce. They are tributaries and waters adjacent to those bodies. So this changes through time. This in 1986 redefined WOTUS to explicitly include adjacent wetlands. However, in 2001, we start seeing the reduction of federal protection. So in this decision, the federal government, the Supreme Court made a ruling that the federal government could not assert jurisdiction over isolated wetlands based solely on their use by migratory birds. So this is kind of an interesting case, but it really shifted the trajectory here. Because then we have Rapanos in 2006. A lot of our Army Corps of Engineers district offices are still operating under this ruling. And the plurality opinion, if anyone's familiar with that, which is great now because the state now is quite a bit more restrictive. And so this introduced this idea of significant nexus. So significant nexus means that the smaller water body, like a stream or wetland, has a meaningful, quote unquote, connection to a larger navigable water body, like a river or lake. So this connection can be physical. Water flows from the stream into the river, or ecological. The wetland filters pollution and helps keep the water in the river clean. So in that case, it would be jurisdictional. There was a second opinion issued in this ruling called the plurality opinion, and it proposed a more restrictive interpretation of WOTUS, stating that only relatively permanent, quote unquote, that is the real language, standing or continuously flowing bodies of water in wetlands with a continuous surface water connection to such water should be protected. And so that is where we ended up today. I'll skip through this just to save time. I want to make a point there that things keep getting passed and repealed, passed and repealed, passed and repealed. And so here we are at another ruling. So now WOTUS has been redefined again with the narrowest scope so far that explicitly states the continuous surface water connection. So in Texas, our timeline is a little bit different. We waited until about 1991. We came up with Texas Wetlands Conservation Plan, and that was great. We kind of transitioned from relying primarily on federal definitions and guidelines for wetlands to developing a state-specific definition and a comprehensive conservation plan. So this was a significant step forward. It outlined inventory efforts and maps and introduced a conceptual regulatory framework. It did not result in state policy or legislation or jurisdiction over any of our wetlands in the state. We are 100% reliant on federal jurisdiction of our wetlands here. We also established a memorandum of understanding, memorandum of agreement, actually, I think is the one. But and this actually gives TCEQ, so our Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, the ability to take over a portion of the federal permitting process that's needed to affect or fill or impact a wetland that's considered part of WOTUS, part of the Clean Water Act protected wetlands. And so, however, TCEQ can really only get involved if that activity is required by the Clean Water Act. And so if there's a wetland now that is no longer protected under federal jurisdiction under the Clean Water Act because it doesn't have a continuous surface water connection, then the state also has no say in making in their Section 401 certification. So 401 ensures that water quality standards are being met. 404 comes from the Army Corps and allows for wetland disturbing activities. So I'll skip through this. This is just some very specific things here. There we go. And then we had take another stab at the Wetlands Conservation Plan in 1993 by just kind of updating it. And really, the plan started to stress a voluntary, non-regulatory approach to wetland conservation. Here we get surface water quality standards also, and I've got that overlapping a little bit. And then 2012, Texas Water Development Board finally includes wetlands in the state water plan. They had not up until that point been explicitly part of that water development plan. And then here we are. So surface water connection. The court's decision means that many freshwater wetlands, bogs, fens, brackish wetlands, and floodplain wetlands cut off from rivers, either by natural levees or built berms, will no longer be subjected to the Federal Clean Water Act permitting and protection. So here's our underground water connection. It does not consider this a connection. So the river and this adjacent wetland here, or neighboring wetland, is connected still to the same water body. As that wetland disappears, oh, that meant to happen at the same time. So let's say that that wetland disappears and reappears, that's still being connected to that navigable water that is protected. So let's say that floods, that's great. And now it's shrunk back down again. That wetland is no longer under federal jurisdiction. However, that groundwater connection has been there the entire time. So let's see. Oh, there we go. So what exactly is protected? The continuous surface water connection is relatively permanent, intermittent. It ties to the regulation slash label of the real life wetlands. So ephemeral wetlands along these types of streams typically only hold water directly following a rain event. And okay, this is the joke. um, we can see through the federal timeline that this intermittency, so whether or not it is continuous surface water or permanently ponded, tends to be the issue. Here's an example of an ephemeral wetland. So these types only exist directly following a rain event. So think the depressional areas along the bayous in Houston, inundated by intense rainfall. They are dry a lot of the time, but they still play a huge role in flood control. Here's intermittent. They may only have water during certain times of the year when groundwater provides water for stream flow, and rainfall is actually a supplemental source of water, but groundwater is the primary source for intermittent. And that's significant because of our previous animation. If groundwater is the primary source for intermittent streams and wetlands, that means it is connected to larger water bodies. And so unfortunately, most of the intermittent classified wetlands and streams are no longer considered under federal jurisdiction with the Sackett ruling. And then perennial, there's some questions here. It doesn't have to be 100% ponded 100% of the time to be considered perennial or permanent. This is an example of the classification of a wetland was considered technically intermittent after a formal delineation here in Fairfax County, Virginia. And it actually enabled the development of 24 rather than 13 houses on a 12-acre parcel. You can kind of see where they kept that little depressional area. And I will be curious to see if that floods, when that floods. So if the Sackett v. EPA ruling is interpreted in its most literal form, so our Army Corps district offices do have some latitude to decide how this is implemented. If it is considered in its most literal form, this leaves 93% of all the wetlands in the state with no federal jurisdiction. So in Texas, in a state that has no state regulations, that has been relying on federal regulations for the wetland protection only, this is a pretty significant step back. Let's get through that. So the implementation is beginning to vary by district. This is going to be a little bit confusing going forward. The Galveston office is relying on the Rapinos guidance. So we talked about that previously. The Fort Worth office is technically a Rapinos guidance, but it's getting a little bit more technical with, stream reach and some other delineation things. So, Todd, am I okay? I'm going a few minutes over.
Yes, you are good. I was about to send you a text saying just that.
Okay, cool. Yeah, if people need to jump off, then it's being recorded. So, okay, cool. I didn't want to race through these couple slides here. So in Texas, we have about 100,000 acres and actually probably a little bit more in mitigation banks. And many of the labeled habitat types on these tracts are considered ephemeral or riverine. So it will actually be up to the district offices to redefine mitigation qualification going forward. We might expect mitigation efforts to decrease, but we'll see. The Sackett decision will undoubtedly affect the compensatory mitigation industry. This is a multi-billion-dollar industry. And basically the way these mitigation banks function is we have a private company or a private entity or agency that comes in and they'll purchase easements. It's sometimes land, but a lot of times it's easements either on public property like our wildlife management areas or private land, and then sell those to companies or developers that are ordered by the federal government under the Clean Water Act to mitigate for what wetland acres they're draining or filling. And there are some strings tied to that in as far as the type of wetlands that you need to provide, what sort of functions that those acres need to provide so that there's a quote unquote no net loss. And so there have been substantial investments made in constructing and restoring freshwater wetlands across the nation to offset permitted impacts under the Clean Water Act. But now the permit requirement, along with the need for that compensation, is gone for large areas of the country. So what will be the response? Among other questions will be how to assess and coordinate remaining state mitigation requirements with the Corps of Engineers permitting requirements for many of these being now absent. Another thing I'll mention here that's going to be impacted by the Sackett decision, and we don't know exactly how yet, is blue carbon. So blue carbon is carbon stored in vegetated coastal systems via plant biomass and soil organic matter, decaying plants. The Galveston Bay area alone actually has around $9 million worth of carbon quote unquote credits right now that it might be able to sell. And this is when one fills a wetland, permitted, hopefully, not only are you losing those wetland acres, but we have discovered now that you're losing that carbon storage as well. And so now we have kind of a secondary compensatory mitigation market that it is forming. And I'm not an expert on carbon markets, but it is kind of a vein or an offshoot of the larger compensatory mitigation. It is not required. It is making a lot of money. And so it's an alternate and complementary approach to mitigation. And it's good because these carbon markets acknowledge the functions that the wetlands play in climate. B Carbon, a private company, and some other partners have actually created the first blue carbon market in Texas. Provides opportunities for commercial, industrial, and private landowners to participate in a blue carbon credit exchange. So the protocol has it has a pretty distinct focus on living shorelines to protect existing coastal wetlands so that their issuance of blue carbon credits is protected. So the question now is how this regulatory uncertainty and the reduced protections will impact the market stability for this new carbon market. And the market growth as wetland loss can be expected to accelerate because surrounding land use impacts the hydrology of even those protected wetlands and thus the soils of potential blue carbon sites. So a lot of this information came from Todd. Todd, I stole some of your summaries here as I was kind of reading up on this, but the 88th legislative session last summer, we went into that with a $33 billion surplus. This amount is larger than the entire budgets of 24 states. And that's just our surplus. So had a very interesting session. So we had a record number of bills proposed and a record number of vetoes. So a very low pass rate in the last legislative session. We did see some really, really good steps forward as far as water protections in the state, though. So this last legislative session actually marked the formation of the first ever House Water Caucus. And so the goals of this is just educating legislative members and the staff on water issues. Of the 150 members of the Texas House, 73 of those actually joined the Water Caucus. And so this really demonstrates the importance of the water issues across the state. I hope that wetlands will be discussed explicitly, but this is brand new, so we'll see how that develops. I imagine it's going to be part of the conversation given the recent Sackett ruling. two major steps forward the last session. So Senate Bill 28 opens up water funding for water infrastructure projects. So it's primarily focusing on water supplies and infrastructures, but it actually impacts wetland management too, because it supports projects that affect water resources, water control structures, and things like that. So it doesn't redefine what constitutes a wetland, but it continues to align with the federal definition established under the Clean Water Act before Sackett. However, we'll see how this develops now that this is kind of in contradiction with each other. And this opens up about $7 billion. So it's, quite a bit for water resource protection. And the other thing that passed that we're pretty pumped about is the Proposition 6 from the Water Development Board. So this actually amends the state constitution and founds the first state water fund or state water implementation fund. So projects that can get funded by this are like building new reservoirs, fixing pipes, groundwater development and protection. The legislation behind Prop 6 actually requires at least 20% of the funds given out to be used for conservation and reuse. And 10% of that is required to be used in rural areas. And so this will be fun to kind of watch play out, and it really could not be more timely. The last thing I want to touch on is the kind of general vibe, the attitude of the Texas constituency. So it was a national survey conducted by the USGS in 2017. And most of the respondents reported being very concerned about the loss of wetland ecosystem services, at least. Other polls have identified availability of drinking water as the most important kind of water wetland related issue in general. And then respondents to the same survey, the USGS one from the beginning, self-reported hunters. People that responded as hunters were most concerned about the loss of wildlife habitat as a wetland ecosystem service. The largest concern among both anglers and wildlife viewers, so our non-conceptive users, was actually pollinator habitat. And all three of the recreational groups still reported clean water in the top three concerns as it relates to water going forward. So clean water quality is the main concern here with the constituency. And the impact, and I'll address this specifically, because the Sackett v. EPA ruling and then the subsequent adoption of this ruling by the EPA, no longer for some wetlands that are no longer considered jurisdictional, if it does not require a Section 404 permit, and a wetland requires a 404 permit because it is considered WOTUS. It is considered jurisdictionally protected under the Clean Water Act. For those waters that are no longer protected, a Section 404 permit is no longer required. What that means is a Section 401 certification is no longer required either, because it's only required if you need the federal permit. 401s are done by the state, by TCEQ. TCEQ, this is the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, is the agency that maintains, regulates, and otherwise monitors our water quality. So if there is a project on a wetland that is no longer considered jurisdictional, that federal protection has been lifted, and that developer no longer needs a Section 404 or federal permitting to fill that wetland or drain it, they also don't have to go through TCEQ to have the water quality impacts assessed and monitored. And so with the constituency reporting an increasing concern about clean water, this will be interesting to watch kind of play out. So during the hearings of Sackett v. EPA, we had there was about 12,000 public comments received. The dominant concern was that the Corps and the EPA's role in all of this was that of avoidance and minimization of wetland destruction and degradation. So we had quite the public outpouring during those hearings. An overwhelming majority of those who submitted public comments were in favor of strong federal regulations in U.S. Wetlands, wetland management. And I know that those are just those that decided to public comment. But as it relates to Texas, so there's a 2019 poll by the University of Texas and the Texas Tribune that reported 2/3 of registered voters believed in the concept of climate change. And I understand that's the poll sources UT and the Texas Tribune. And so there's a bias there in who's likely to respond or even receive that poll. Climate Nexus, a Yale University program on climate change communication, also identified that among those that identified as Democrats, 88% of those agreed that climate change is happening, a view shared by 74% of self-identified independents and 44% of self-identified Republicans. And so I know that number is very disparate, but it's rising, and this last legislative session too has demonstrated the enthusiasm for bipartisan cooperation in regards to wetland and water management in the state. So government action, surprisingly and not very surprisingly, government action, stronger federal and state regulation on water. In these polls was more strongly supported by citizens residing in areas that have been hardest hit by the effects of climate change in recent years. So an example of that is 70% of Houston area voters in Harris County say that, then this is across the board, Democrats, Independents, Republican, this is bipartisan. 70% of Houston area registered voters say that their local area has been impacted by flooding, compared to almost half of the Texas voters overall. And 28% of those reported having to leave their home, at least temporarily, because of the extreme weather. These are the people voting for and calling for more regulation, more protections. So again, people are becoming more insistent on increased regulations. So we are relying on the Texas constituency and the 89th legislature. So I am not abreast on the issues of any proposed bills that might come to the floor in January. But if you do want to know, I'm sure Todd knows. And so with that, I'll take any comments or questions, and I apologize for going 17 minutes over.
Rachel, thanks. And we do have time for Q&A, and hopefully some of our audience members are going to be able to stick around for that. Let me just say that, in January, there won't be any bills on the floor. They, won't really get going in terms of, talking about bills like that probably till March. But so you got a little extra time in there. So I'm going to kick off the questions, and I've got 6 questions in the Q&A, but I want to kick off with your thoughts about the new status and trends report from the federal government. That report looks at the period of 2009 to 2019, which does not, of course, include the post-Sackett period. The Sackett decision of the Supreme Court was in 23. And I was surprised that the new status and trends report showed that the loss of wetlands accelerated in 2009 through 2019, that period, because prior to that, we had seen a deceleration. So I'm curious about what you think about that, and anything else that you saw in that report regarding Texas that you thought was interesting.
Yeah, I think I think that was kind of an interesting time period, we saw some really, really severe droughts. In fact, El Paso saw their worst drought ever. Um, and so when those droughts happen, those municipalities hold water back. And so I think there was a lot of freshwater emergent and riparian loss. There was a lot of forested loss as well. Some of that due to new reservoirs going in, and a lot of that due to drought. So I mentioned with East Texas in particular, which is where most of our wetlands are. Yeah, there's like, flooding from, installation of new reservoirs. And so those wetlands are lost, and there's, droughts that dry things up, and then there's developers that drain and build. So that's like direct effects, but everything's pretty connected. And so if there's anything upstream that's happening, so let's say a city doesn't release as much water from the reservoir because they are in a drought and the reservoir levels are low and they're using that for drinking water and for city operations. Everything downstream gets a little bit drier. So not only are they dealing with the drought still, but they're not getting as much water from upstream either. And so a lot of those riparian wetlands then dry up. A lot of those bottomland hardwood forests that exist along those East Texas rivers also dry up. And so we'll see, the definition of that the Army Corps uses of under normal circumstances, how far back exactly is considered part of that, normal cycle. Coming out of such a long season of drought, I'll be curious to see if there are any, and I hope that in the next report they might include this too. How many of those wetlands actually had their classifications changed from relatively permanent to intermittent, just because of water being held back upstream by dams and reservoirs.
Gotcha. So let's go to a question from our audience about that same report, which asks or says, hey, there's a net increase in pond wetlands in Texas, according to that report. And, this individual's interested in any trends that you noticed in Texas related to ponds and if those trends were positive or negative in terms of impacts.
On ponds specifically.
Yes.
Yeah. That's hard to say. And the reason why is because a lot of our wetland counts and quantification comes from the National Wetlands Inventory, which is hosted and created by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And while it is a invaluable tool and they're updating it all the time, I was in a meeting all last week in DC, and they presented on some kind of new plans, new improvement plans coming up, and things are about to get pretty spatially explicit, and we're pretty pumped about it. But that wetland mapping actually misses a lot of the smaller wetlands, the isolated wetlands, the ponds. And some of that's data storage issues, and some of it is, just the limitations of our remote sensing technologies for now. And so it's difficult to kind of quantify what the ponds that exist now. And thus it's going to be hard to determine if they're increasing or decreasing, because a lot of those isolated wetlands do not fall under federal jurisdiction. I would assume that because of the increasing development and expanding development, that we'll see a decrease in those. But as far as, like for playas, we don't exactly know how many playas we've lost. There's some estimates, but because some of these potholes, and I don't know if in your question, you're referring to like playas as ponds as well. But those wetlands are supposed to be dry for a very long time. And so, at what point do you actually consider it lost? So that's tough.
Gotcha. So let's go to the next question. Have you seen any interest or success in using the flood buyout programs to increase the acreage of wetlands in places like Houston?
Say that again. I'm sorry. I mean, see if I can see the chat anywhere. Let's see.
So can you see the Q&A?
I am, oh, Q&A. Sorry, I was looking for chat. Okay.
Yeah.
Um,
So this is the top question, the one at the very
oh,
top.
okay, I see that. Okay, any interest or success in using flood buyout programs to increase acreage of wetlands in places like Houston? I'm actually not familiar with flood buyout programs. I haven't, worked a lot with people that have been part of that. Um, but yeah, so I guess the answer to that is I don't know. I can find out, but that's just not something that I've had the privilege to work with. So unfortunately I can't provide you anything there.
No, no worries. I don't know is a legitimate answer. Um, so let's go to that next one. In your opinion, what are the greatest needs in terms of wetlands research and advancement of wetlands conservation slash restoration?
So I think, and I might have had a different answer than this prior to the Sackett ruling. I think now um, there is a really, really dire need to educate and also, quantify to actually, find out for sure and map out this groundwater to surface water connection. It's really easy for 9 non-ecologists to look at two separate bodies of water and say those aren't connected. When we know in general, oh, it is groundwaters, aquifers. But I think the terminology that actually used to be used, and it's just not anymore, and if you talk to especially a lot of the landowners that are land producers and that are live in rural areas and have been producing on private lands for many years, they don't talk about certain rivers drying up. They talk about the rivers going underground. When things get too dry, oh, the river went underground. Sometimes they'll say dried up, but we see that terminology a lot, seeing less and less, hearing it less and less. But I think demonstrating that groundwater connection is really kind of urgent, honestly, now, and really kind of educating and bringing home that idea that it's not that the river is gone quite yet. It's not that the wetland is gone quite yet. It's that it went underground. Um, and so it's still that connection is still there. That is part of the river. It doesn't need to be connected on the surface for it to be completely connected. Um, I get that's my opinion on it.
Right, right. Gaining and losing streams is a lot of the, if you're in parts of the upper watershed in the Colorado, you're very familiar with that. Um, so another question is any insight about the improving technology for identifying wetlands remotely? In other words, satellite, aerial imagery, AI assistance. And it goes on to say, is it going to be possible to monitor changes in wetlands much more precisely and frequently in the future? And what would be the potential benefits of that?
Yeah. So up until this point, a lot of the wetland mapping and classification has relied on spectral imagery. And so that's in wavelengths like red, green, blue, infrared. We can't see infrared, but we see in red, green, blue. Um, and those satellites that gather that data that give us those images, like Google Earth images and stuff, are subjected to, or they are limited by weather. So if there's cloud cover, um, it's not getting a picture that day. And so it can be difficult, especially in really humid areas like on the coast, to monitor those changes very effectively, and really capture the dynamism of like wetlands drying and rewetting and drying and rewetting. And so we miss a lot of that, and subsequently miss, what's happening long term with those wetlands. Um, Back in 2015, there's a new satellite. It's not new anymore, but it actually uses a synthetic radar. So it's an active sensor. This sensor has actually been used quite a bit, you know, in recent years. And if you search Sentinel-1 wetland or water in Google Scholar, you'll see a lot come up, just publications in the last 2 years. And the reason why this is good, this is a significant advancement, is that it is not weather dependent. So whether or not there are clouds, it's going to pierce right through it. And it generally does a pretty good job identifying water bodies. And so those models that are using that imagery to kind of feed into the map, are becoming a lot more accurate, and it's at a 10-meter resolution as well instead of 30, which we've used, majority of the time up until 2012. And so yeah, I think using that radar imagery, satellite-borne radar imagery, has already significantly improved the remotely sensed products.
All right. So next question. I'm interested in reading more about the health-related topics you mentioned. For example, earlier in the talk, you mentioned the algal blooms and their residual toxins making their way into human breast milk. May I have a link for that? And she's got her email address in here. And I'm wondering if maybe you can just mention some sources that she might be able to Google.
Yes. So I just copied and pasted your email. Um, and I will send you some of the papers that I've read on that, to kind of at least start that Google search.
Okay. Next, how do you see the overall condition of Texas wetlands?
I think that, to and on a positive note, I think that, especially meeting other state wetland managers, we're doing pretty well. We see a lot of like wetland loss, but if we're looking at the actual management of the wetlands, if we're looking at the water quality in the wetlands, it's not great, it's not perfect. But because of just like the massiveness of our state and the size of these wetlands and the tremendous amount of water that gets dumped on our state and flows through the rivers and floods over the banks and fills the wetlands and flushes the lakes and reservoirs, we're doing pretty well. I feel optimistic about it. I hope that, the good that comes out of the recent Sackett ruling is that a lot of our water issues are now going to get prioritized. It is at least a huge part of the discussion. I mean, it was like 24 hours on the news cycle, 24 hours a day, for weeks. And while the decision sucks and is going to have some pretty serious implications, they already are in Virginia and Mississippi. But like it's the conversation is intensifying, and people who weren't aware of those issues are now aware of them, and I think that's great.
Well, that makes me feel better. I was actually a graduate researcher at EPA in DC in the 80s when all the back and forth was going on about the delineation manuals.
Mm.
And I was working in the wetlands program in the Office of Water. And so, for me, it's been kind of wetlands have been kind of a dismal endeavor. I hate to call it that. because I always feel like, oh, we're making progress, and then you get some real reversal. But it does seem like the tools that are available to address um, the loss of wetlands um, are expanding at least. And so it's at some point, maybe we'll see that there'll be a more widespread recognition of the benefits that they provide the public, and therefore maybe more funding to preserve them and to restore wetlands that have already been lost. So I'll keep my fingers crossed for that.
Yeah.
So before we go ahead and sign off, Rachel, I want to tell you that certainly appreciate you doing this webinar today. We've got some comments in the Q&A about from the other participants who felt like you did a great job. And I'm hoping that everybody was able to see in the chat how you can find the article that's the subject of the webinar and the report from the feds, and your podcast episode in which you go into some different details than you did today during the webinar. We will have this webinar posted on the Water Journal website. It might take a few weeks, but we'll have that up there eventually. And I think Zoom will allow me to send a link to the presentation out to everybody who at least registered. And just so you know, the registration spiked in a few minutes before we got on the air, and so we got over 100. I think we're about 102. So,
Nice.
so thanks again. Any final words from you?
No, no, I've got my email and work cell right there. I text just as much as I email, so feel free to shoot me questions or send me rebuttals or anything.
Great, great. Thanks again, Rachel. Much appreciated.
All right, thanks. Oh,
All right, everyone. That is the conclusion of the webinar. And as I said, you will be able to find it on the Water Journal website here in the next couple of weeks. Thank you for joining us, and we will have another webinar next month. And I think the topic of that is going to be karst aquifers and protecting them from hazardous waste spills. And then we will have another one after that, probably about hill country reuse in the Texas hill country. Thanks again. This is Todd Bottler. Talk to you soon.